This city was destroyed by a single bomb dropped from a single airplane. Its name is Hiroshima. The American government says that 68,000 people were killed here. The Japanese say there were many more. The Hiroshima bomb had an explosive force 36,000 times greater than any previous bomb. It was an entirely different kind of bomb, an atomic bomb. Its force came from the energy released by smashing the nuclei of atoms. This phenomenon introduced a new terror into warfare: radiation. Not only did the bomb cause damage by blast and fire, it also filled the air with deadly radioactivity. Many who were not killed by the explosion died slow, agonizing deaths from radiation sickness. The invention of this bomb is one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. It opened a new era called the Atomic Age. Why did it begin like this? Will it end the same way? The atomic bomb was the product of an incredible wartime enterprise known as the Manhattan Project. It cost over $2.5 billion and required the construction of the biggest industrial complex ever built by man. It employed over 590,000 people. The Manhattan Project was created as a consequence of a letter from Albert Einstein to President Roosevelt. The letter said that recent discoveries in nuclear physics indicated that it might be possible to build a bomb of devastating power, and that the Germans were known to be working on such a bomb. If German scientists succeeded in building the atomic bomb, Hitler might be able to use it to conquer the world. So the president was persuaded that if the bomb could be built, the United States should be the first nation to build it. To accomplish this, the Manhattan Project mobilized immense economic, technological, and scientific resources. All of this in the middle of an intense war effort when the Americans didn't even know if such a bomb could be successfully produced. Brigadier General Leslie R. Groves was put in charge of the entire project. He was faced with the staggering task of building a bomb that had never been built before, on the basis of a scientific principle that had never been proved, and out of an element that didn't even exist in nature. According to the scientists, the bomb's power would come from the energy liberated when the nuclei of atoms were broken apart in a chain reaction. That is why it was called the atomic bomb. It could be made out of one or the other of two elements, uranium-235 or plutonium-239. Since no one knew if large enough quantities of either element could be produced, it was decided that scientists should work on both possibilities, despite the expense. A plant to produce plutonium was built at Hanford, Washington. A uranium plant was built at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. To design the actual bomb, a giant laboratory was created at Los Alamos, near Santa Fe in New Mexico. The town became a secret city. The people who worked there couldn't even tell their relatives where they were, much less what they were doing. Top scientists were also working at constructing the first nuclear reactor under the football stadium at the University of Chicago. This immense mobilization of resources took place under conditions of tension and anxiety. Scientists, military men, and administrators were working against time. Since time was so important, all possibilities were being explored at once. The first nuclear chain reaction was achieved on December 2nd, 1942 at Chicago. This proved that the theory behind the project was correct, but there was still the problem of whether the bomb would actually work. Not until February 1945, 2.5 years after the Manhattan Project was started, did plutonium begin arriving at Los Alamos. A team headed by Robert Oppenheimer immediately began building a plutonium bomb. Uranium began to be available a short time later. On July 16, 1945, in a remote desert area near the town of Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first nuclear explosion in history occurred. It was a plutonium bomb explosion known by the code name Trinity. The closest observers were 5 miles away. A scientist who was at Alamogordo wrote later that the whole effect was so staggering that he found it difficult to believe. Even before the Trinity explosion, the uranium bomb had been completed and was on its way to Hiroshima. That city would be its first test. A second plutonium bomb would follow it shortly. Its destination, Nagasaki. At 8:15 on the morning of August 6, 1945, the bomb fell on Hiroshima. According to American figures, 68,000 men, women, and children were instantly killed. The Japanese say 260,000. The Nagasaki bomb killed 38,000, according to the Americans. The Japanese say 74,000. Many more died later from injuries and radiation exposure. This is Admiral William Leahy, Chief of Staff to President Roosevelt and later advisor to President Truman. Referring to the atomic bomb 5 years after Hiroshima, he said, "My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages." Is this judgment too harsh? Why did we use it? We decided to build the bomb because we were afraid that the Germans might develop it first. But the Germans surrendered before the bomb was ready to be used against them. Why then did we feel it was necessary to use it against Japan? We should look first at the official government explanation of the decision to drop the bomb, and then we shall review criticisms which have been made against that decision. Even though Truman had just become president in April 1945 and knew very little about the development of the bomb, it was necessary for him to make a decision about its use. Truman revealed the main reason he had decided to use the bomb in a speech he made to Congress after the bombing.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. We won the race of discovery against the Germans. We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans. We shall continue to use it until we completely destroy Japan's power to make war.
The main argument, then, was that the atomic bomb would shorten the war and save lives. Not only American lives, but Japanese lives as well. Without the use of the bomb, there was a danger that the Japanese would continue to fight, and a bloody invasion of their homeland would be necessary. It was over 3.5 years since the Japanese had started the war by attacking Pearl Harbor. During that period, they had fought fiercely and had killed thousands of Americans. Their determination was symbolized by their use of kamikaze attacks, suicide flights by pilots who would deliberately crash their bomb-carrying planes into American ships. Would the whole Japanese nation fight in such a suicidal way when their homeland was invaded? The American government estimated that if an invasion of Japan were necessary to end the war, the fighting would result in over 1 million American casualties. According to the Truman administration, the Japanese could be persuaded to end the war only by shocking and dramatic evidence that resistance was foolish, and that the United States had the power to destroy Japan completely. The administration believed that the atom bomb would cause the necessary shock. The government also felt that the bomb was no more inhumane than the massive firebombing raids that had taken place over Hamburg and Dresden in Germany, and over Tokyo in Japan. The incendiary raid on Tokyo in March of 1945 did more damage and caused more casualties than the atom bomb in Hiroshima. This is Henry L. Stimson, Secretary of War in the Truman administration, and a key person in the decision to use the bomb. After the war, he explained his position.
My chief purpose was to end the war in victory with the least possible cost in the lives of the men in the armies which I had helped to raise. I believe that no man holding in his hands a weapon of such possibilities for accomplishing this purpose and saving those lives could have failed to use it and afterwards looked his countrymen in the face.
This, then, was the position taken by the Truman administration in explaining its decision to use the bomb. It shortened the war, and it saved lives. But his explanation was not accepted by everyone at that time, and it is not accepted by everyone today. The critics of the Hiroshima decision say that there are important weaknesses in the government's argument. In the first place, they say, Japan was already prepared to negotiate an end to the war, and therefore it was not necessary to use the bomb. The critics cite the many peace feelers put out by the Japanese government. Japanese envoys in Europe had let it be known that Japan was interested in ending the war. The United States government should have taken these efforts more seriously, the critics say. The war might have been ended without either the bomb or an invasion of Japan. On the other hand, we learned after the war was over that the Japanese cabinet was deeply divided on the question of surrender, and that even after the bombing of Hiroshima, it was necessary for the emperor to intervene in order to bring about the surrender. The main reason that the Americans did not negotiate with the Japanese was the Allies' famous doctrine of unconditional surrender. This had become a slogan repeated over and over again by Allied leaders. What did it mean? The Japanese were afraid it meant that the emperor would be tried and even executed as a war criminal. Some scholars think that if the Americans had given assurances that the emperor would be safe, the Japanese would have been willing to surrender earlier. But even though the Americans actually did allow the emperor to retain much of his authority when the war was over, they refused to say in advance that they would do this. The critics make another argument. Even if one grants that the bomb was necessary to persuade the Japanese that unconditional surrender, whatever it meant, was better than total annihilation, could this not have been demonstrated without dropping the bomb on a city and killing so many people? Wasn't it possible first to drop the bomb on some uninhabited target in full view of the Japanese so that they could see its terrible, devastating effect? They could have been warned that if they did not surrender within a certain time, then the bomb would be used on a city. In fact, this approach was suggested during the war by a group of scientists who had worked on the bomb and who began to have doubts about the wisdom of using it. Their spokesman was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist by the name of James Franck. He was a refugee from Nazi Germany and had been working on the Manhattan Project in Chicago. Franck chaired a committee of atomic scientists which drafted a report on the bomb. It argued for international control of nuclear weapons to prevent their being used in future wars. The bomb could not be kept a secret, the scientists said, and it should be controlled before it was too late. The Undersecretary of the Navy, Ralph Bard, wrote a memorandum in June 1945 arguing that Japan should be given some preliminary warning and some information about the power of the bomb before it was actually used. None of these arguments for delay was accepted by President Truman. He and other key decision-makers were afraid that a demonstration explosion might not work. What if the demonstration were a dud? Also, there were only 2 bombs that were ready. They had taken a long time to produce, and they were terribly expensive. There was a strong feeling that they should not be wasted on a demonstration. And if the target for a demonstration bombing were announced in advance, there was a danger that the Japanese might move American prisoners of war into the target area. Undoubtedly, it is much easier to analyze the problem now than it was during the war, when Americans were dying in battle and Japan was a hated enemy. It would have been extremely difficult then to decide not to use this new weapon in the way that would hurt the enemy the most. Critics ask, would not the risks of a demonstration have been worthwhile in order to avoid the horrors of Hiroshima? The issue was not only the lives of the Japanese who died in the Holocaust, it was also the precedent that was being set for warfare in the future, when such weapons might someday be turned against the United States. Critics claim that the arguments become more forceful when one considers Nagasaki. An atomic bomb was dropped on this city only 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima. This was hardly enough time for the Japanese to evaluate the damage and decide what to do. Why wasn't more time allowed? Why kill more thousands of civilians before giving the Japanese government time to survey the damage of Hiroshima and recognize what a terrible force had been unleashed against them? In recent years, as more and more historical documents have been made public, some new responses are being made to these questions. Many of them were provided in a book by an historian named Gar Alperovitz. This book has raised a storm of controversy and has had a profound influence on the way that the Hiroshima decision is now viewed. Alperovitz argued that the bombs were dropped not so much for their effect on Japan as for their impact on the Soviet Union. The effect of the bombing, according to Alperovitz, was not primarily to end the war with Japan, but to start the Cold War with Russia. At the time of the Trinity explosion, 3 weeks before Hiroshima, President Truman was at Potsdam bargaining with the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin about the peace settlement in Europe. Stalin was determined to set up satellite governments in Eastern Europe to provide a security barrier against any future war. Truman wanted to prevent communist domination in Eastern Europe. Truman's Secretary of State, James Burns, has also explained that the administration wanted to end the war with Japan before the Russians came into it. If Russia declared war on Japan, then presumably she would have some claim to participate in the peace settlement, as she did in the case of Germany. Of course, the Alperovitz explanation of the Hiroshima decision is not accepted by everyone. It is vigorously contested by Herbert Feiss, a widely respected historian, and will no doubt be debated for a long time. Today, Hiroshima is a new city in a new world. But is it a better world? Now, one bomb delivered by one airplane or one missile, or even smuggled in one suitcase, can entirely destroy a city many times larger than Hiroshima. It is a world in which defensive measures must therefore be 100% effective. A defense which is less than that is no defense at all, and no one has ever devised a defensive system that is 100% effective. Thus, every city in the world is a potential Hiroshima. If there is a war among the nuclear powers, this might be New York, or Chicago, or Los Angeles. Each year, on the anniversary of the bombing, the people of Hiroshima hold memorial services. Visitors come from all over the world to commemorate the terrible suffering that took place here and to remind the world of the necessity of preventing nuclear warfare in the future. They show visitors the evidence of what the bomb did to buildings and to human beings. These people do not argue about why the decision to drop the bomb was made, but perhaps the rest of us should. Do you think President Truman made the right decision when he ordered the bombing of Hiroshima? Do you think a president of the United States today, or the leader of any other country, should order the use of nuclear weapons in a future war? The future of mankind depends on the answers to questions like these.